I was driving through the intersection when a motorcycle sped past me, its engine roaring as the rider and passenger whipped by. For a moment, I couldn't quite place it, but then I saw her. There was no mistaking Lee. Her blonde hair streamed out behind her, dancing in the wind as she clung to the back of the bike. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as a flood of questions rushed through my mind. What was she doing? Why was she on the back of someone else's motorcycle at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? I had never seen her behave like this before. Before I could fully process it, I found myself shifting gears, my foot pressing down hard on the accelerator. The motorcycle sped down the road, and I followed without thinking twice. My mind raced, the uncertainty growing with every turn they took. I kept my eyes fixed on them, not daring to lose sight. They veered off onto a winding path that led into a thick wooded area, and soon they were out of view. My pulse quickened, and I knew I had to follow. I couldn't let this go. I pulled over to the side of the road and parked my car, then got out and began walking toward the trees, my feet moving almost instinctively. The warmth of the afternoon sun bathed the woods in a soft, golden light. The air was thick with the buzz of insects, and a light breeze brushed against my face, offering no comfort. My thoughts were a blur as I ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of nature surrounding me, masking the turmoil inside. As I walked further, the distant sounds of voices grew louder, sharp and distinct. My heart began to race as I realized I was getting closer. And then I found them. They were on a blanket, lying on the ground in a secluded clearing. Lee was on top of him, her body moving rhythmically in a way I had never seen before. Her chest was bare, moving with each passionate motion as she rode him with wild energy. The man, completely absorbed in the moment, didn't even seem to notice me. His face was twisted in ecstasy, his eyes closed, completely unaware of my presence. It was as if they were in their own world, oblivious to anything outside of their pleasure. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. It was surreal, almost like a scene from a twisted, forbidden dream. The sunlight filtered through the trees above, casting dappled shadows over the scene, making it appear strangely picturesque despite the devastation I felt inside. I couldn't help myself. I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling, and began snapping pictures, each one capturing a moment of betrayal in a frame. The images were almost beautiful in their composition, like something out of a sickeningly poetic story. The man groaned loudly, his voice guttural and raw. It was an animal-like sound, one that made my stomach churn. That noise snapped me back to reality, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I cleared my throat and stepped forward, my voice steady but cutting. "Hey, Lee, who's your new friend?" They didn't react at first, lost in their own world. I repeated myself, louder this time, the anger rising in my chest like a storm. Just as I spoke again, the man let out a loud, climactic groan. The air became heavy with the silence that followed. For a long moment, everything was still, and then their frantic scrambling began. They rushed to cover themselves, panic evident in their eyes. The man shot up from the blanket, his face flushed with shock and indignation. It took me a split second to recognize him. Bill Avery. He was one of Lee's colleagues, a teacher at the same school. He was younger than her, and I had seen him before, though I hadn't expected to see him like this, half naked, his eyes wide with alarm. So this was how they spent their free time. This was how they chose to blow off steam after long days of teaching. The thought twisted in my gut. I didn't hesitate. I looked at Bill coolly, my voice steady. "You've got a family, don't you, Bill? A couple of kids. If I'm not mistaken." I raised my phone, showing him the photos I had just taken. "FYI, your wife gets these as soon as I get back to my car." Bill opened his mouth to protest, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. "You can't. This is blackmail," he stammered, his face a mix of fear and outrage. I ignored him, turning my gaze to Lee. She was still frozen in place, her face pale with shock, her eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at me. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but the words seemed to escape her. I could see the fear in her expression, and for a moment, it almost felt like a small victory. "You're smart enough to know what this means," I said, my voice calm but cutting. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving them scrambling behind me, their desperate whispers fading as I walked deeper into the woods. Later that evening, when we got home, I knew without a doubt that things had changed between us. Lee's disheveled appearance told me everything I needed to know. Her usual confident, composed self was gone, replaced by someone trying desperately to salvage what she could. She headed upstairs to shower, and when she returned, she was wearing the same outfit she always wore when she wanted to look irresistible: tight yoga pants and a snug t-shirt. It was her usual attempt to charm her way out of anything, but it wasn't going to work this time. "You're wasting your time," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "This marriage is over," she whimpered, her voice trembling with desperation as she spoke. "It was just a fling, Todd. It didn't mean anything." I shook my head, the anger inside me rising again. "It meant the end of us." Her voice grew louder, pleading with me. "Please, Todd, don't do this. You can't divorce me over one little mistake." I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. "A mistake?" I repeated incredulously. "You call that carelessness?" Lee flinched but tried to brush it off, her eyes searching mine as if I might still forgive her. "He wasn't special. I don't even think about him anymore. I'm all yours, okay?" I stared at her, my expression one of cold finality. "I saw you, Lee. You loved every second of it. And we both know you'll be back for more when the thrill calls you again." Her face shifted, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she realized that I wasn't backing down. She leaned in closer, trying to use her most seductive voice. "Come upstairs, baby. Let me prove how much I love you." But the anger I had been suppressing for so long surged to the surface. "Really, Lee?" I said, my voice low and firm. "You think I'm that stupid? I'm leaving, and I'm not coming back." Her face turned crimson with rage, and she spat out, "You're making a big deal out of nothing, Todd. I've been faithful to you for most of our marriage. You're gone 2 weeks out of every month. Do you know how many offers I've turned down? This was the only time I ever said yes." Her audacity stunned me. The words she spoke were like daggers in my chest. I stared at her, my heart heavy with a mixture of regret and resignation. "Goodbye, Lee. Wait to hear from my lawyer." I couldn't believe how much I had endured in this short marriage. The constant lies, the constant vigilance to maintain something that had clearly broken long ago. It was time to walk away. I left without another word, driving 2 towns over to find some peace. When I arrived, I stopped in front of a small, charming bungalow, the kind that seemed out of place in the otherwise unremarkable neighborhood. A beautiful woman with chestnut brown hair stood in the yard, holding the hand of an adorable 8-year-old girl. When she saw me, she released the child's hand and walked over to me, her eyes filled with concern. "I thought you were on your trip," she said softly, her voice warm and genuine as she searched my face for any signs of distress. I didn't answer her with words. Instead, I kissed her deeply, letting the pain of the past dissolve in her warmth. In that kiss, I felt everything I had been running from for so long melt away. The pain, the anger, the loss. Everything faded, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was home. She wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, pressing herself against me, and whispered softly, "Welcome home, Stephen. Your family has missed you so much." The day had already been overwhelming, but Mike had no idea it could spiral any further. The envelope in his hand held life-changing news that he could hardly begin to process, but now he faced an even more difficult challenge: telling Michelle. They had been married for 3 years, and after graduating college, they had worked hard to build their careers and establish financial stability. But now, the future that seemed so secure was clouded with uncertainty. Mike had no idea how they would handle this unexpected crisis. As he drove home, his thoughts consumed him. The weight of the envelope in his hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile, and his mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. He answered it, his voice heavy with exhaustion, his mind still trying to comprehend the events of the day. "Hello," he answered, barely masking the tension in his voice. "Hey, honey, is everything okay? You sound upset." Michelle's voice came through the line, filled with concern. "I'm sorry, it's been a rough day," Mike replied. "I'll explain everything when I get home." "All right," Michelle said gently. "I have something to share with you too." "Oh, and I forgot to mention, my parents are joining us for dinner tonight." Mike winced internally. He loved Michelle's parents, Tom and Mary Beth, but tonight of all nights, their presence felt like an added burden. Still, he tried to push aside his frustration, knowing that dinner with them was already planned. Maybe, he thought, having them there would help Michelle see things from a different perspective. Perhaps they could offer some comfort, some way to view this crisis as a temporary setback that they could get through together. He decided he would hold himself together during dinner, but after that, he needed to share the news. They had to face it head on, even if it was painful. "I got it. I'll see you soon. Love you," Mike replied, his voice flat. "Love you too," Michelle said, her voice filled with warmth before the call ended. Mike exhaled deeply and placed his phone down, groaning audibly. The thought of facing Michelle's parents, especially after the devastating news he had just received, seemed almost unbearable. But maybe, he reasoned, it would be easier to break the news with her parents there. At least then, they wouldn't be alone in dealing with it. Maybe they could offer a sense of reassurance that things weren't as bad as they seemed. When Mike finally arrived at their modest apartment, the tension in his body didn't ease. He gripped the envelope tightly, as though its contents might spill out at any moment. Inside, Michelle and her parents were waiting for him, seated together on the couch. Michelle looked radiant as always, her smile lighting up the room. She was holding her mother's hand, and for a moment, Mike's heart ached. He knew he was about to shatter that happiness, and the thought filled him with dread. But there was no avoiding it. He had to tell her. He had to tell them. Before Mike could speak, Michelle's warm voice filled the room. "Hey, sweetheart. I know today's been tough, but I have something exciting to share with you." She took a deep breath, her voice filled with emotion, and Mike could see how much this moment meant to her. "For the past 10 months, we've been trying to have a baby, and I was starting to lose hope. But today, Mom came with me to see a fertility specialist. They did some blood tests and we talked about our options. A little while later, the nurse handed the results to the doctor, and he told me he couldn't help us." Mike frowned, still confused by her calm demeanor. He was not expecting her to speak so matter-of-factly about something so potentially devastating. "But," Michelle continued, her eyes sparkling now with joy, "I'm already pregnant." Her words landed like a bombshell. Mike stood frozen, his mind scrambling to process what she had just said. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, and before he realized it, tears began to spill down his face. He was overwhelmed, but not with the joy Michelle had hoped for. He was consumed with a deep, gnawing fear. Michelle, seeing his tears, rushed toward him, thinking he was overcome with happiness. But as she reached for him, Mike recoiled violently. "Don't touch me," he shouted, his voice harsh, startling everyone in the room. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Tom and Mary Beth exchanged looks, their faces filled with shock and confusion. They couldn't understand what was happening. Michelle looked at Mike, her expression faltering, her eyes searching as for an answer. "What's going on, Mike?" she asked, her voice breaking, full of hurt and confusion. "I thought this is what you wanted. This is what we both wanted." Mike's voice trembled with emotion, and for the first time, the bitterness he had been holding back slipped through. "What I wanted he said, his tone sharp, was to have a family with the woman I love. To raise children together, grow old together, and be surrounded by love and happiness. That's what I wanted. Michelle's face crumpled, her heart breaking as she tried to understand. But we're going to have a baby, Mike. Isn't that the beginning of the life we dreamed of? No, Mike snapped, his voice cutting through her words. You're having a baby, not us. Michelle's confusion deepened as she looked at him, her heart shattering. Mike lifted the envelope in his hand and waved it in the air, his eyes wild with frustration. Did you forget that I also went to see a specialist today? He spat. I wanted to know how we could improve our chances, Michelle. This, he said, his voice shaking with anger and despair. This is what I got instead. A stupid piece of paper that destroyed everything. Tom, trying to defuse the tension in the room, asked cautiously, What's in the envelope, Mike? Mike's jaw tightened, his body rigid with anger. He turned to Tom, his voice laced with venom as he spoke. It's the results of my tests. Then, without warning, he turned back to Michelle, his voice now filled with raw emotion. I'm infertile, he spat, his words like a dagger. The room was still. No one spoke. The weight of Mike's words hung in the air, thick with shock and disbelief. Michelle stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the brutal truth. She had just shared her happiest news, but now, the happiness they had once envisioned together seemed to slip further away, replaced by an unthinkable reality.